Free the land. What an honor to be here at NCORE. I'm so excited, overjoyed, overwhelmed to be invited to such an important event at such an important moment. You know, I'm, like many of you, a little overwhelmed by the news of Maya Angelou's passing. Yet another ancestor being made, yet another elder who's become an ancestor. In a year where we've lost Amiri Baraka, Vincent Harding just last week, Chokwe Lumumba just 2 months ago, even Nelson Mandela right at the end of last year in December. We've lost so many and so much. And it's particularly painful and difficult because the moment itself demands so much from us and of us as leaders, as academics, as intellectuals, as journalists, as students, as citizens. We are all compelled to do so much at this moment. And so I think about Maya. I think about Maya Angelou. She says the cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. His voice is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. And it's freedom that we're here for. It's the idea of freedom that we are fundamentally wrestling with every single day, every single month, every single year, trying to negotiate a world where the condition of freedom is beset on all sides by forces and by people and by institutions that are obsessed with sustaining forms of unfreedom. And that's why we do these events. That's why we have these conferences. That's why we attempt to, as you all say, start the conversation, because the condition of unfreedom is pervasive, not just in Indiana, not just in the United States, but it's indeed a global condition. In the wealthiest of spaces, there are people who are still wrestling with hunger, wrestling with poverty. In the most opulent of areas, they are neighbored by areas where you have to go 3 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles to get fresh fruit and vegetables. Food insecurity becomes a key part of our notions of unfreedom in this moment. We are in an area that has, and in a nation that has become obsessed with first-class jails and second-class schools. We have become so obsessed with incarceration that we have exported it to Guantanamo, to Abu Ghraib. We see it in Gaza, the largest open-air prison in the world. We've monetized it and profitized it. We've created a world where female bodies are so endangered that they can't walk down the street without street harassment. We just saw a shooting, an awful tragedy that absolutely reminds us that we need gun control. And there's no doubt about that. Access to weapons, no access to mental health care. It's a dangerous combination. It's a dangerous combination, but that cocktail is worsened by the idea that this gentleman out in California at UCSB, if you read his work, if you read the legacy he left behind, the memoir he left behind, if you look at his internet antics, his rantings and such, you see that he was also deeply poisoned by misogyny. Deeply poisoned by a rape culture that says that female bodies are not only always subject to vulnerability, always subject to assault, always unsafe, always unprotected, but always accessible to male bodies and male desire, irrespective of female interest. That's a world that we got to talk to. And that's the world I want to talk to y'all about today. It's not just these individual issues going on in the world. It's about what do we do at the intersection. Because the condition of unfreedom lays at the intersection, where we fail to fully and adequately and thoroughly and rigorously interrogate the ways in which these various forms of unfreedom collide and overlap and compromise and undermine our chances at realizing a full notion of humanity. So for me, when you come to NCORE, that's what we're supposed to be doing. This is a great place to do it because you can't do this at home. You can't. Ain't nobody at your house doing this. Y'all gonna go back. I mean, you go back to your home institution, it's like two of y'all. Right? Am I lying? Can't even get a good spades game. You got two in a possible. And so we come here to find community. We come here to get re-energized. We come here to get recharged. We come here to get informed. I was talking to my dear brother, Elon Dancy, earlier. We were interviewing, and we talked about the idea of preaching to the choir, but choirs need to get preached to as well. Can we give a round of applause to Elon Dancy as well? Brilliant scholar. Very smart man. Other than joining Alpha Phi Alpha, made very good life choices. Nobody's perfect. But the question then becomes, as we do this in community and in love, and as we regenerate these ideas and as we build with one another, what do we take home with us? Because it would be an awful tragedy to come here and leave feeling good and not do anything with it. Stuart Hall calls out to us. He said, what in God's name is, he said, against the urgency of people dying in the street, what in God's name is the point of cultural studies? What's the point of studying representations if it does nothing to the life that might live a little bit longer or die a little bit sooner? It's at that moment that we recognize the ephemerality, the elusiveness of theory. If we do nothing but to make the world better, then theory has let us off the hook. We got to do something when we leave here. And so the things that I want to talk to you about in a little bit of time that I have here is to help us answer that question of what do we do now? How do we negotiate unfreedom in ways that make the world a little bit better? One thing I think we have to always consider and engage is the practice of deep listening. We live in a country that doesn't listen. We don't listen. We talk. Ain't no shortage of talking in this country. 24-hour cable news. I'm on CNN now. I used to be on Fox News, on the visiting team. Man, I'm serious. You think the Spurs had it bad last night? No shortage of talk. 24-hour blogs. Everybody got an opinion. Twitter. Everybody's got a tweet. Everybody's got an Instagram. We even visualize our literacy practices. People just be taking pictures of stuff taking pictures of your food. Yourself. I woke up like this. No, you didn't. But listening is something else. It's not being quiet while someone else is talking, waiting to say what you were going to say anyway. Listening requires a deeper level of engagement. Listening requires a deeper level of commitment. Listening requires you to recognize worth and value in bodies and identities that have been rendered silent, that have been rendered marginal. We have entire election cycles where Democrats and Republicans don't listen to poor people. Where's the deep listening to poor people? They were like used car salesmen back in 2012. Who could bail the middle class out first? Who could not be too burdensome on the rich? But when it came to the poor, it was just those people. Some of y'all in your research do that. You talk about black people and poor people and marginalized people, but you do it by proxy. What does it mean to bring their voices, their skills, their talents to the table to get them to not just answer your questions, but to ask their own fundamental questions about what it means to wrestle with unfreedom? But you got to be willing to listen to it, even if it comes in a black body, or as y'all academics say, in an urban body. You know, urban is like secret agent talk for race and poverty. Even if it comes in a female body, in a world that has so much hate and antipathy toward women. Even if it comes in a trans body. At a moment where the world remains so profoundly transphobic and misogynistic, even within LGBT circles, that we don't fundamentally wrestle with what it means to be trans. We have so much work to do, but we have to listen for it. We also have to listen for silence. You know, y'all, a lot of y'all are education folk. You know, a student ain't talking. You think they're disengaged. You think they're lazy. You think they don't care. You think they're disrespectful. And not only is that a ethnocentric analysis, in many countries the notion of silence means something very different, but it's also an impoverished analysis within this context, because within this context, silence, sometimes you listen for the silences. There is power in silence. There's resistance in silence. There is joy in silence. There is possibility in silence. We must listen for the moments of silence as much as the moments of voice. We must listen to the underside of that note. We have to listen. We have to have a fundamental engagement with young people, not viewing them as social burdens, but listening to them as stewards of the future. It's amazing that even in education circles, how much we pathologize and demonize young people and criminalize young people. We lionize the elders of the past, even the great Maya Angelou, may she rest in peace. We lionize her at this moment, but when she was born on April 4th, was that 1926? 28? Glad Negroes got Google, man. You ain't know that. As Maya Angelou is navigating the mid part of the 20th century in the midst of Jim and Jane Crow, as she's escaping the repression and oppression of the United States, and she travels to Africa and she returns to help Brother Malcolm and Martin. No one said this is going to be the poet laureate of our nation. They saw her as an enemy of the state. Quite literally. When King dies in 68, many people had decided not to listen to him. He's a Negro preacher. Stay in the Negro preacher's place. So you talking about anti-war, anti-Vietnam? No. That ain't your place. Enemy of the state. Malcolm, when he dies in 65, enemy of the state. And as young people, these were the people who we imagined not as future leaders, but as social burdens, as people who we had to be wary of, as people who we had to be skeptical of. It's only in later years do we see them as who they are now. What's my point? My point is that we must invest in young people early. We must understand their social value. Martin Luther King's kindergarten teacher didn't know he was going to be Martin Luther King. I'm serious. He was just a middle class. They probably say he's a middle class preacher's kid. You know how preacher's kids is. Talk kind of slow. I want to go to recess now. There's no way to forecast that you will have the next Martin King or the next Malcolm X or the next Ella Baker or the next Fannie Lou Hamer. But you have to believe that in all pockets of our world, young people in our neighborhoods are literally littered with young, beautiful, brown, and black genius. But to listen to them, we have to dismantle crippling public policy that criminalizes them, as Du Bois said, with the a priori approach to the Negro. Prior to investigation, we will determine who and what you are, and we've already decided you're a criminal. That's why it's so easy to have anti-baggy pants legislation in Florida and in Texas and in Michigan and in California, because we've decided that even their fashion is criminal. It's easy to have civil injunctions against gangs on the West Coast. Even if you ain't in a gang, you're still subject to state surveillance. It's easy to have curfews of sometimes 9 o'clock in major areas in the summertime for black and brown people, because we've decided between that and stop and frisk that we want to make it illegal to be young and black and outside. We don't listen to them because we have a language of containment and blame rather than investment and love. That's our narrative. We got to listen to these folk. We must also listen across difference. So many of us have our thing. I'm an anti-prison activist. I'm a prison abolitionist, quite frankly. And it was through the process of doing prison abolition work that I came across the case of C.C. McDonald, a trans woman from Minnesota, who was attacked and in an act of self-defense, or as a result of an act of self-defense, ended up being charged and convicted. And not only was she charged and convicted for self-defense in a transphobic crime, she ended up inside of a men's prison. Misgendered, subject to sexual violence and assault, torture. That's torture. That wasn't my issue. That wasn't my thing. I didn't know much about, quite frankly, I didn't know anything about it. But by doing anti-prison work, I could see the intersection between a world that is obsessed with mass incarceration and a world that sees black bodies as the most vulnerable things to put in these spaces of incarceration. And then that renders poor people even more vulnerable. And that renders trans poor people even more vulnerable. And so there was interesting intersection between those two, but we had to listen to each other to realize that our work overlapped. There's a connection between the war on drugs and the war on drones. But y'all gotta talk, and y'all gotta listen. How am I an anti-racist activist if I ain't talking about food insecurity? But I gotta listen. Y'all get what I'm saying? We have to listen to one another so that we're not merely locked at the arms singing "We Shall Overcome," but we're also locked at the circumstance. Because America has a different response when our coalition is united. And quite frankly and pragmatically, they have a different response when white people are involved. John F. Kennedy walking through Harlem in 1960 holding up a black baby. Dismissed as a campaign stunt. He trying to make Adam Clayton Powell happy. Those northern liberals trying to get cheap votes. Kind of like when Bill Clinton goes on Arsenio Hall playing the saxophone. Or Hillary going up to Selma a couple years ago, going to church, trying to clap on beat. She did her best. Juxtapose that to Appalachia just a few years later when Bobby Kennedy walks through West Virginia holding up that white baby whose belly is bloated. Snot's coming out of his nose. That baby's crying too. We begin our war on poverty. White suffering is less tolerable in this country. We sometimes have to whiten the face of poverty to make it real. Now, our collective work is obsessed, preoccupied with changing that reality. We want a baby in Boston and a baby in Birmingham and a baby in Berlin and a baby in Botswana to all be worth the same. That's our collective project, but as a practical matter, we must align our coalitions to get stuff done. We got to listen, but we also, as a community of activists and intellectuals and writers and thinkers, get America to listen to itself. That's what black people have always done. That's what this tradition has been about. The black radical freedom tradition has been about getting America to listen to itself, and it still has lessons for America right now. Read David Walker's Appeal. If y'all ain't read David Walker's Appeal, read David Walker's Appeal, a preamble together with 4 articles to the colored citizens of the world, but particularly and most expressly those of the United States. Long title. Important book. Book so important, they used to hide it behind the Bible on Sunday so they could read it to brothers and sisters. A preamble together. It was an anti-slavery document, but it was a preamble together with 4 articles and a cell phone. That's called signifying. And it was a signifying tradition from which the book emerges, a preamble together with 4 articles modeling itself implicitly after what? The Constitution. Showing America, listen to yourself. You have a document that promises freedom for all people, and yet the Negro wallows in unfreedom. This isn't just an appeal to colored people. This is an appeal to America to be true to what you said on paper. You fast forward just a few decades to narrative of the life of Abelardo Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, written by himself. Getting America to listen to itself. We gonna make a book. Y'all ain't wonder what black people, all their books be like written by himself? Written by herself, Phyllis Wheatley poems on various subjects. It's because they didn't think the Negro could write. It was not axiomatic that the Negro had written it just because the book had their name on it. Because you had folks like Kant and Hume making the counter-argument. You had Jefferson making the counter-argument that the Negro didn't have the capacity for original thought and original literacy. That's why Phyllis Wheatley had to go before a trial and be interrogated by the Oberlins and the Welsleys. Not a coincidence, those names. Slave-owning families interrogating her to see whether or not she knew what she wrote, challenging her in Greek, asking her about biblical allusions, questioning her Latin, questioning the elegy she wrote for a dead soldier, asking her about the letter she wrote to General George Washington, interrogating her. They ain't know it. No, that's the extraordinary audacity of white supremacy, right? You can be at the polls checking Negroes for literacy when you can't read yourself. She passed with flying colors. Y'all might as well just reset that clock. I ain't gonna finish in 5 minutes. But the question of Negro literacy still lingered because at the seat of literacy was humanity. And so they were saying black folk can't do this. So by the time you get to Olaudah Equiano, it wasn't just a journey about the horrors of slavery. It was also an attempt to get America to listen to yourself. When he said, I wholly entreat your pardon for putting before your work so devoid of literary merit written by an unlettered African, what he was saying is, through signifying, I'm sorry for making y'all read such a bad book, but he was making one of the great literary pieces of the century. That's how we do. And that's how they do, because they already saw the contradiction. Unfreedom lies in contradictions that on the one hand exploit people, and on the other hand attach to them dangerous narratives that justify their continued unfreedom. What do I mean? I mean, they say Negroes can't read, but they made a whole lot of laws stopping Negroes from being able to learn how to read. They said Negroes are lazy, but they made them slaves. They said we were dirty, but we spent most of the century cleaning people's houses. They said we were uncivilized, yet we raised their children. The journey to ending unfreedom lies at unloosening, or rather loosening the stranglehold we have on these contradictions. Reimagining who we are and what we are by getting America to listen to itself. Imagine how much simpler this conversation on guns would be if we listened to the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms didn't mean the right to wear all arms of any size in any place at any time. We just walk around with rocket launchers, like, no, dog, that wasn't it. Imagine the ways in which we could liberate our political prisoners. Free Mumia. If we understood the First Amendment, imagine how this immigration debate would be different. If we listen to the 14th Amendment, there's a way in which we don't listen to ourselves because it lets us off the hook. I'm saying we can't do that no more. I'm gonna move on though, because I could talk about just listening all day. We have to not just listen, we have to remember properly, y'all. Remember truthfully. We have to have a sense of history. Unfreedom lies right next to forgetfulness. The key to freedom is to have a sense of history, not to destroy these ancient landmarks, to not forget. I talked to my father. He's born 1928. Wilkes County, Georgia. Faked his age, snuck into the army right after the war. His brothers fought, my uncles fought in the war, World War II, and had to ride behind Nazi POWs on the way back. After fighting for freedom elsewhere, ostensibly, they come home and their money is still counterfeit. Can't buy a hamburger. Can't sit at a Woolworth lunch counter or Horn and Hardart. My father's high school class took a trip to the Washington Monument, couldn't have their pictures taken in front of it. Dogs could. We don't remember the past to wallow in misery. Part of how you appreciate the journey is to know what already happened. You can fully appreciate growth and expansion and democracy in its full bloom when you get a sense of history. I ain't mad at that. But we still got to hold on to this stuff because it helps us make sense of the moment. But we live in a moment that has a kind of truncated obsession with history. Andreas Hussein, the great cultural theorist, talks about the time paradox of the 20th century, the late 20th century and now the early 21st century. He talks about the way in which, on the one hand, we love to remember stuff. There is nothing more time obsessive than the neoliberal state. We love to commemorate. We love to talk about all the stuff we've done. We've built more museums and mausoleums and commemorative placemats and plates and coins than anything you've ever seen. We have a kind of instant nostalgia. TV shows like Best Week Ever. Or you watch Love and Hip Hop or Real Housewives of Atlanta or Real Housewives of this, and 10 weeks of show, and then the next week they got the reunion episode already. A kind of instant obsession with the past and configuring and reconfiguring the past in ways that are not just redemptive, but maybe even salvific. We imagine that our very nation state can be delivered and saved by an obsession with memory, but as Toni Morrison would say, but the problem with our particular way of remembering things is that it ain't true. It just isn't. Because at the same time, we want to forget. I was in Denver on August 28, 2008, when Barack Obama accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency. We were immediately reminded that 45 years prior to that, to the day, to the hour, almost to the minute, Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. August 28, 1963, at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. King gives an I Have a Dream speech. 45 years later to the day, Obama gives a speech accepting the Democratic Party's nomination. Now, the Disney-fied narrative of American public life tells us a narrative of completion. King dreams. Obama fulfills a dream. Now, we know on its face that ain't true unless King's dream was to have a black person as the business manager for a neoliberal, white supremacist, homophobic, capitalist empire. Just saying. But beyond that, it's a truncated version of history that doesn't allow us to fully appreciate the moment. Because yes, August 28, 2008 made a whole lot of people feel good about America and its possibilities. August 28, 1963 empowered and emboldened and inspired us for what was to come. But before there was an August 28, 1963, there was an August 28, 1955, when Emmett Till is murdered. Gotta remember that too, family. You got to remember August 28, 2005, when Katrina reaches its height. And an entire community, an entire culture, an entire city has been rendered disposable. Disposable. No help from FEMA, no help from the state. People shopping for shoes. People staying in their towers. And I ain't just talking about Bush. I'm talking about y'all professors that will stay in the university, in the academy, writing books on social movements while one is happening underneath you. But it isn't just about having a fuller, richer, thicker sense of history. It's also about understanding the moment. Because when I think about Emmett Till, that little black boy from Chicago walking through Mississippi, criminalized visually, accosted, pursued, stalked, attacked, murdered, disposed of, and then their killers for the entire generation went unpunished by the state. And then his mama, Mamie Till, stands up and says, I don't have 1 minute to hate. I'm going to pursue justice. Then I think of a boy named Trayvon. Pursued, stalked, criminalized, murdered, and his killers goes unpunished by the state. Think about Jordan Davis. Same story. Even down to the mama who stands up magnanimously and says, I'm going to pray for my son's killer. We keep reenacting the same rituals over and over and over again, acting like it's the first time. The quest for social justice has to be steeped and dipped in history so that when it happens again, we have a perspective, we have an expectation, and we also have a resolution. Right now, public schools are under attack. Public education is under attack. But we can't be so reactionary that we lose sight of the fact that the public is always under attack. We have to situate our resistance and our analysis in history. That means that we don't just remember and listen, we also discern. We must ask different questions. We must ask what the historical context for this stuff is. Public's always been criminalized. You know how they criminalize the public? By making it black and brown. The very notion of the public good in the neoliberal state has been seen as bad, antithetical to democracy, ironically enough. We've promoted the private good over the public interest. And how do you get the public to vote against itself? You make it black. So that in the public imagination, everything that's public is black. Public schools, public transportation, public housing, public options in healthcare, hell, even public intellectuals. We make them black so y'all won't want it. And not just so that white people won't want it, so that black people won't want it, because ain't nothing black people love more than white people. I don't care. In the 80s, we did it through the language of the welfare queen. Back, Sally Jesse Raphael, Phil Donahue, even Oprah before she got right. She'd have these shows, you know. Up next, woman makes $1 million a year off welfare going state to state. Now, that might be, there's like 2 people that ever did that in the history of America. And they found them and made that the template for welfare. They didn't say she was black, they just said, up next, Taquanda from the Taylor homes. They would ascribe things to her character. She was lazy, she was ignorant, uneducated. Stuff didn't even make sense. She has 3 kids, 5 baby daddies. How you do that? And by making us not like Shaquanda or Taquanda, they made us not like welfare, even though the primary recipients of welfare are white, female, and young. And in doing that, they created a world where even the white, female, young welfare recipient who needs it and deserves it is voting against welfare too. And so at a moment where this, and that's part of the bizarre calculus of this, right, is that it's not just problematic, it's counterfactual. Public education ain't just in Brooklyn, although we do like Brooklyn. Public education out in these other rural areas is public too, and subsidies to build in the suburbs is public housing. Nobody got a bigger welfare check than AIG. But they control the discourse, and therefore they control the analysis and the result. We have to ask different questions. Y'all kids keep getting pulled over and arrested and criminalized. And we keep asking about driving while black. Stop asking about driving while black. Ask about patrolling while racist. Now, that's not just a discursive shift. That's an empirical shift. That's an analytical shift. That's an epistemological shift. Real right, it is. What would it mean for our unit of of analysis to be white supremacy, or white supremacists, excuse me. What would it mean for us to analyze white supremacy, or even say white supremacy? When we talk about the dropout phenomenon, we are already talking about it in a way that focuses on the choice of leaving school by an individual student as opposed to focusing on the push-out phenomenon, which would shift our unit of analysis toward the institutions, the sources, the forces, the practices, the rituals that make somebody not want to be there. When you talk about an achievement gap, you reify the gap. What would it mean for us to talk about an investment gap? As Gloria Ladson-Billings says, an education debt. What would it mean for us to talk about a care gap, a mentoring gap, a funding gap? It would completely reorient the way we think about this stuff. We're not worried about why the quantum bubbles in C instead of B on a test as much as we are why the test itself exists as a measure. We wouldn't be asking what women can do on college campuses to not get sexually assaulted. I promise, just give me like 3 more minutes and I'll be done. That's what preachers do, right? I'll take my seat in a minute. I know y'all tired. I'm going to leave you alone now. But we wouldn't ask the question about, is there any more perverse a question to ask what women are doing to promote sexual assault? What are women doing to prevent sexual assault? The question should be, what are men doing to prevent sexual assault? Because it really kind of is that simple. If you don't sexually assault somebody, nobody will be sexually assaulted no matter what they're wearing, no matter how much alcohol they had, no matter who's with them. We got to ask different questions, family. But remember, it's at the intersections that those questions must be asked. 2.5 million people are in prison right now. People who should be on your campuses. People who have the intellect, who have the gifts, who have the talent. Could be in Penn State instead of the state pen. But over the last 40 years, we've gone from having 250,000 people incarcerated to having 2.5 million people incarcerated. We've increased the prison population tenfold, and the simple answer is we created a generation of criminals. Or a generation of slow runners. They just don't get away from the cops like they used to. There's a lot of narratives about black people. Being slow runners ain't one of them. The truth is that unfreedom lies at the intersections. We've created 40 years not of criminals, but of criminalization. People don't commit crimes, they commit acts. And acts get criminalized. Unfreedom lies at the intersections. In the 80s, we had mental health resources. We had mental hospitals. Some of y'all cousins were there. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And we closed them. The Reagan obsession with shrinking the state that was pretty much doubled down on by Bush and somewhat Clinton and somewhat Obama, particularly on these matters. The shrinking of the state, by the way, shrinking the state doesn't mean you shrink the whole state, just means you shrink the part that helps people. You expand the military state. That train ain't never late. But by shrinking the state, we took away community-based health funding, and as a result, people who were getting mental health resources were now on the street. And then we did what? We criminalized being on the street. We want to clean up the cities, the urban cities. anti-loitering, anti-panhandling, anti-trespassing, no public urination, no public drunkenness. Now, on their face, these things sound good. Nobody's in favor of public urination. But when you criminalize these acts to people who are on the street because they've been transcarcerated, they've been taken out of one form of containment to another, then what you end up with is people who are mentally ill on the street who are now criminalized for being on the street, so they're now transcarcerated because now they go from the mental institution to the prison. So we've essentially criminalized mental illness. We've taken people who are getting investment in drugs, or rather, we invested in drugs that help people. When you're in a mental institution, now you're on the streets self-medicating. And at the same time, what hits the streets? Crack. Whitney told us this is cheap. They give receipts. No, but seriously. So people were suddenly taking drugs to self-medicate mental illness, and then we begin to intensify a war on drugs. A war on drugs that has made drugs cheaper, easier to get, and stronger than ever. We lost. So now we have a generation of people who are incarcerated because of the medical addiction of drugs. I'll say it again, the medical addiction of drugs. So we've criminalized mental illness, we've criminalized medical problems, we've criminalized poverty through homelessness, and then you go to jail and you're subject to sexual abuse, sexual trauma, sexual violence, no rehabilitation. They take away grants for funding so that they can't access higher education through prison. And as Michelle Alexander taught us in her magisterial work, when you get out, you can't vote in many states. You couldn't access public education. You couldn't, or higher education. You couldn't get public housing if you had a drug conviction, and Negroes couldn't get jobs before they went to jail. So you're now consigned to second-class citizenship. We've made an industry of prison. That's why your schools look like prisons. More money on surveillance equipment in schools than prisons in the last 5 years. Kids walking through school, take them 20 minutes to get in because they gotta walk through a metal detector, a hand scanner, a surveillance camera, a body search, a locker search, a fingerprint scan, a parole officer, probation officer, school officer. It takes you 20 minutes to get into a school. When you get in, ain't nobody stopping you from leaving. We have to reimagine this thing, family, and that's the last thing I'm gonna tell y'all. I got a lot more to say, but I'm gonna just say one more thing. Seriously, because I know we got other people, I wanna be respectful of other people's time. We have to act bravely. We have to act bravely. Maya Angelou was courageous. Malcolm X, courageous. Sonia Sanchez, courageous. Acting bravely means we must speak dangerous truths. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Speak the truth though it may be bitter to others." What does that mean? It means that even in moments where we're rendered unpopular or marginal, we must be brave. Being on Fox News didn't take an act of bravery. They was always wrong. The courage of acting bravely is to speak the truth when it's tougher, when the guy you voted for is sending predator drones to Yemen and Afghanistan, and chemical strikes in Syria being proposed, and imperial counter-revolutions in Libya, just for example. When all that stuff is happening, y'all have to have the courage to speak up then too. Acting bravely is an act of love. Acting bravely is to do the work even when you don't get credit for it. Some of y'all are on campuses with 50 black people, and y'all got like 100 organizations. I'm talking to the students now. Everybody president and vice president. That's not our tradition, family. That's about you. That's the MySpace selfie mentality that says that I got to be the lead, I got to be in charge, I got to have a mic, and if I ain't got it, I ain't doing nothing. That ain't what you come from. We come from a tradition of relentless hope and of selfless action, what King called dangerous unselfishness. We come from a tradition that says when dogs bite us in Birmingham, we bleed everywhere. We come from a tradition that says that women's issues are men's issues too, that LGBT issues are straight issues too, that poverty is everybody's issue. We come from a tradition that says we must fight, we must struggle, we must believe, we must work, we must sacrifice, and I know sometimes it gets hard. I know sometimes you feel lonely. I know sometimes you feel troubled. I know you feel like you're the only one on campus making sense. You're the only one in the faculty meeting advocating for black people. You're the only one in the faculty meeting that's not a misogynist. You're the only one here who's skeptical of the university's dangerous closeness and proximity to becoming a multinational corporation more than an institution of higher learning. I know you're mad. I know you feel like you're the only one that's mad that the graduate students are being exploited and that the labor is being casualized and that adjuncts are being overworked. I know you feel like you're alone. I know you feel like you're by yourself when you're fighting police brutality, not just in the hood, but on your campus. I know you feel alone. I know you feel alone when you're doing this work. I know you feel uncongratulated. I know you wish the tenure board valued social justice and real work as much as bean counting and technocracy. I know you feel alone. But family, we come from a tradition of people who did this thing alone. Harriet Tubman went through the woods alone. Martin King was unpopular when he died on 68. When Malcolm X sat in that Audubon ballroom, Maya was one of the few people that still gave him support and love through the OAAU. Fidel said, I made a revolution with 36 men. If I could do it again, I would do it with 6 who had absolute faith. I know you feel alone, but this struggle is always about that. 13% of black folk marched for civil rights. In the midst of Jim Crow and Jane Crow and segregated lunch counters, only 13% were fighting for freedom. What you think you're gonna get now? With Starbucks and air conditioning and iPhones. What you think you gonna get? We don't need large numbers of people. We need people here who have absolute faith, absolute commitment, absolute courage, absolute belief in this project. A great philosopher once said, the homie said, Hov, it ain't many of us. Less is more, nigga. It's plenty of us. God bless you.